Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes Manchester and Leeds, to our YouTube channel. And first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guest, Professor Kirsty Hooper. Thank you to all of you, our audience, for being with us this afternoon, on which we start a new series named Encuentro in Spain. In this series of talks, we will explore the different and diverse parts of Spain from the perspective of the 19th and early 20th century British travelers and expats who encounter a very different country from the sunny south of the romantic legends about Spain. Using their own words, images, we will follow their footsteps to discover what drew them off the beaten track, which of the sights and views they experienced that they found most noteworthy, and how they made sense of their encounters for the audience back home in Britain. Our host, I will introduce now, and coordinator of this series is Dr. Kirsty Hooper, who is professor of Hispanic Studies at the Warwick University and specialist in Spanish, Anglo-Spanish and Galician cultural history since 1800. Her books include Writing Galicia into the World, Mondari's Vigo Santiago, A Brief History of Galicia's Advariant Tourist Boom, and The Advariant and the Making of a Modern Spanish Obsession, a book, this last one, which was also launched in Instituto Cervantes. He currently holds a Leavenworth Major Research Fellowship for the project Hispanic London Culture, Commerce and Community in the 19th Century City, 2020-2023. So today our discussion will center on the region of Galicia, a region in the northwest of Spain where Galician is spoken in addition to Spanish, and with its cool climate, rain, sometimes a lot of rain, abundance of water and green hills, has many similarities to regions in Britain like Wales or Scotland. A fascinating region that was visited by some Anglo-Saxons travelers in the 19th century, who were struck by the affable and hardworking nature of the Galicians and the presence of the culture. Galicia was famous for being the rival point of the Camino de Santiago path, where for centuries the end of the world, what was considered for centuries the end of the world Finisterre in Galicia, is a region that leaves no one indifferent to the person who visits Galicia. No one is indifferent because there's such a beauty and diversity. As Catherine Gascoigne-Hatley says, marveling at the Galician landscapes, if you have never seen the sun sink in a scarlet flame behind the Sea Islands, you have not yet to live. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us in this talk, at the end of which we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. So you are very welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and then I will ask Dr. Hooper. Thank you again. Muchísimas gracias y te paso la palabra a Kirsty. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me, and welcome to everyone who's here to listen. So when we imagine a party of British tourists in Spain, the rugged green Atlantic landscape of Galicia in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula probably isn't the first backdrop to come to mind. But while package tourism to Spain is closely connected in the British imagination with the beaches and tablocs of the Mediterranean, the last 2 decades have seen a diversification of the destinations and activities marketed at British visitors to the country. And perhaps the most visible of those new destinations has been España verde, or green Spain, the strip between Spain's Atlantic coast and northern mountains that comprises Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, and the Basque Country. When the London Guardian picked Galicia as one of its hot hotspots for 2004, highlighting its classic rural scenery, green rolling hills and isolated farmhouses. It's placed as a destination for the discerning traveller wishing to enjoy hidden delights in a place the tourists ignore, was assured. The key pillars of the marketing of Galicia for 21st century travellers are the recent region's isolation, authenticity and unfamiliarity, making it a destination that, according to another Guardian journalist, feels like it's in a Spanish time warp with a culture all of its own. But despite the rhetoric of contemporary journalists, this isn't the first time that Galicia, its landscape and culture have been discovered by British travellers and holidaymakers. During the 19th century and into the 20th, a variety of British writers, artists, missionaries, soldiers, sailors, travellers and entrepreneurs made their way to Galicia, and many of them left us their impressions of this unfamiliar and often unexpected corner of Spain. From the last third of the 19th century onwards, the proliferation of railways, industrial colonies and Atlantic-facing ports of call began to change the shape of British imagined geographies of Spain, giving a new prominence alongside the sunny south to what the prolific writer and self-publicist Alfred Frederick Calvert glibly sketched as the Black North of the kingdom. So in today's talk, we're going to meet some of the Victorian and Edwardian travellers who visited Galicia and explore the varied and sometimes surprising ways they found to make sense of what they encountered there. So one of the first writers to present Galicia as a reasonable destination for British travellers was Richard Ford, who spent 3 years in Spain between 1830 and 1833. And in 1845 compiled his observations into the highly idiosyncratic Handbook for Travellers in Spain and Readers at Home. And this handbook, albeit in increasingly sanitized form, was continually re-edited after Ford's death and remained an essential tool of British travellers to Spain until its final edition in 1898. Ford was a professional expert on Spain, a reviewer, a commentator and art critic who was the London media's first port of call for views on Spain for almost 30 years. His writings imbued with a strong sense of British superiority. And for example, he encourages his reader, and I quote, when brought in contact with petty authorities, to at once hoist his colours and take a high ground by informing his questioner that thanks to God, he is an English gentleman. Señor, gracias a Dios, soy caballero inglés. Ford visited Galicia in 1832 as part of an extensive horseback tour of northern Spain, and he translated his travels into 13 recommended routes, taking in the cities of Lugo, Coruña, Ferrol, Mondoñedo, Santiago de Compostela, Pontevedra and Orense, as well as the dramatic lighthouse at Cape Finisterre. Aware that his readers would most likely have known very little about a region that he says is almost unknown to the bulk of Spaniards, as few ever go there, Ford employs a range of comparisons to translate Galicia into more familiar terms, and chief among them is his description of Galicia as the Switzerland of Spain. He describes it vividly as rainy, mountainous, fertile, rich in natural resources. He says its bacons and hams rival those of Extremadura. It has fruits of the berry kind which carry us back to Devonshire. He's really effusive about the land and its produce, but at the same time, he's dismissive of the people, noting that, he says, the ignorance and poverty of the peasants is painfully striking. Art, science and literature languish where the olive and orange and vineyard flourish. The best wines would rival the vintages of Portugal, where the commonest pains taken in the making, but everything is managed in the rudest, most wasteful manner. His view of the welcome to be afforded travellers is similarly stark. Galicia, he says, is seldom visited except by muleteers, according to whose wants and demands the many discomforts are regulated. It need not be said that where people sup without chimneys and sleep without beds, that vermin which were deemed a plague in Egypt are here held to be free denizens by long prescription. Ford is rude about the homes, rude about the cuisine, and rude about the people, noting that aged before 30, the women soon seem models for witches, while the men are litigious and boorish, seldom giving a direct answer, Seen in their wretched huts, they are scarcely better than their Iberian ancestors, who were little better than beasts. And it's worth saying that this isn't special treatment for Galicia. Richard Ford is rude about everybody and everything. It's worth reading his book to see just how awful he is. Not only is the Galician coast, he tells his readers, the terror of those who travel by sea, but the province offers few facilities to wayfarers by land. One real road only connects La Coruña with Madrid, while the rider from Andalusia will probably find, as we did, that his faithful barb will fall sick in these parts from change of fodder. But for travellers willing to face or disregard all of his warnings, Ford provides, as I've said, 13 interconnecting routes in which the granular level of practical detail useful to individual travellers on horseback or by diligence is interwoven with quotes from classical literature, colourful accounts of historic battles, and satisfied references to British military and commercial achievements. And perhaps the densest example of this is the very florid account he gives of the port city of Coruña, where he advises readers to climb to a viewpoint above the landlocked bay. He says it's twice as big as our Tor Bay, where glorious and sad recollections crowd on the English sailor and soldier's memory. Here on July 26, 1386, John of Gaunt landed, claiming the crown of Castile in right of his wife. Hence, July 2nd, 1554, the bigot Philip II set sail for England to marry his sweet bloody Mary. Here again, in May 1588, was refitted that last of religious crusades, the Spanish Invincible Armada, which sailed out July 26 to easy and immediate defeat, an event which Spaniards to this day ascribe to the elements, italics, exclamation mark. His strongest words, however, are reserved for Spanish treatment of the tomb of the British general Sir John Moore, who had been killed at the Battle of Coruña in 1809. Moore's tomb, he says, was for many years a temple dedicated to Cloacina Gallega, that is a Galician sister of the Roman goddess of sewers. It was restored, but soon again bemired by the Coronees, who made a dunghill of a sepulchre raised and paid for by others to a brave ally who died fighting for the independence of Spain. Now restored again, he fears it in danger from French-influenced Spanish politicians, which may explain the particular anger with which he writes. But Coruña's interest to British visitors goes beyond past military and naval achievements. Ford also celebrates the vast quantities of iron pucheros, or cooking pots, made by an English company in the suburb of San Lucia, while in contrast, lamenting that English steamers can only call at the port in summer, since the Spanish authorities, he says, refuse to admit the vessels to pratique after sunset, by which truly Iberian absurdity they deprive their city of this great advantage. So, as becomes clear from Ford's examples, Britain and Galicia have a surprisingly long shared history, going back at least to the arrival of John of Gaunt and his retinue in the late 14th century. In the decades following Ford's visit, while British travellers visiting Galicia were still relatively few and far between, increasing numbers did begin to make their way there, largely for commercial and industrial reasons. Landing at one of Galicia's busy ports after the long voyage across the Bay of Biscay, they would discover a thriving network of Anglo-Galician commercial and industrial partnerships. Thanks to their strategic positions as nexuses of international and transatlantic seagoing networks, Galicia and Britain had enjoyed close mercantile and maritime connections for centuries, which intensified enormously with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. One of the earliest of these partnerships, these Anglo-Galician industrial partnerships, was centred on the Ferrol naval shipyards across the bay from Coruña. As the shipyards expanded in the second half of the 18th century, British and Irish workers were imported to expand the Spanish Guilds base, and many settled in the town. More than a century later, the Spanish government founded the Spanish Society for Naval Construction, whose shareholders were primarily British, bringing Ferrol another influx of British and Irish shipwrights and engineers. Annette Meakin, visiting in 1907, noted that the shipyards, once so famous as the arsenal of Spain, were now, she said, in the hands of English shipbuilders, one of the world's greatest dockyards. A pilgrim landing by boat at Coruña or Ferrol after the mid-18th century would very likely have heard English, Scots, Welsh and Irish spoken alongside Galician and Spanish at the docks and in the waterfront streets, as British and Irish shipbuilders, sailors, engineers, miners and even missionaries mingled with their Galician counterparts. Of course, such partnerships were not only water-based. Travelling 100 kilometres east from Ferrol, along Galicia's rocky northern coastline, you reach the village of Sargadelos, whose name is synonymous today with Galicia's characteristic blue and white pottery figures, which I have one just here, terrifying blue and white pottery face, there she is. And that's a very typical example of Sargadelos work. Between the 1840s and the 1870s, Sargadelos, then managed by the master ceramicist Edwin Forrester, was home to a small colony of British craftsmen, most of them from the potteries area of the English Midlands. Many of them married local girls and eventually returned home to Britain with their Galician wives and Galician-born children. Alternatively, travelling 125 kilometres southwest from Ferrol to the Atlantic coast at Noia, you would find from the second half of the 19th century a landscape pockmarked with small and not so small mining operations, many of them British owned. And one of the most prominent was the San Finks tin mining complex, acquired in the 1880s by the Burberry family from Coventry, which is where I'm speaking to you from right now. And in fact, they are buried at a churchyard about 5 miles away from where I'm sitting at the moment. Yet more British connections lay to the south. In her monumental 1909 study, Galicia, the Switzerland of Spain, which you will hear more about later on, Annette Meakin drew readers' attention to the 45 young Englishmen employed at Vigo in connection with the cables laid by the British government, who, she says, even provided an English newspaper for circulation in Vigo. The nearby naval port of Villa Garcia was a regular stopping point for warships, whose officers, as Meakin discovered, had a habit of going inland and buying up all the tourist postcards. And there's still a small British naval cemetery in the town that holds the remains of 15 British mariners who never made it home. Meanwhile, the nearby town of Marín, now a training centre for the Spanish Navy, was home from the 1880s to a group of evangelical missionaries led by British-born Lydia Wirtz and her Cuban husband Luis, who met when Luis, an engineer, came to Marín to build a railway viaduct. Despite often violent resistance from supporters of the local Catholic Church, which included beatings and kidnappings, all chronicled in Lydia's memoir, Spanish Harvest, the couple went on to seed Protestant churches all over the region. But probably the Anglo-Galician collaboration that made the greatest impact on Galicia's place as a destination for British travellers was the West Galicia Railway, for whom Luis Wirtz came to build that viaduct. Begun in 1863 and opened in stages until it was finally completed in 1899, the railway was designed and constructed by the British engineers Thomas Rumble, George Mould and John Stephenson Mould, and managed between 1880 and 1919 by London-born John Truelock, who's remembered today as the grandfather of Galicia's Nobel Prize-winning novelist Camilo José Cela. During a very long and tortuous construction process, blighted by fallings out between the Galician organisers and their British engineers and financiers, Truelock, the Moulds and other British railway workers lived in and around the towns of Padrón, Carril and Iria Flavia, where a rather excellent railway museum today commemorates work. The West Galicia Railway was just one example of what contemporary observers called railway mania, a drive to domesticate the Spanish landscape by providing the transport infrastructure that would enable the growth of investment in Spain, and above all in Spanish mines and other Spanish industry. And of course, as the newly established railway lines began to make the territory manageable for investors, mining and railway engineers, they also brought it within the reach of travellers and tourists. Within a year of the Spanish rail line reaching the French border in 1864, British tourists could consult 2 new publications, which between them drove British knowledge about Spain into the railway age. Bradshaw's illustrated handbook to Spain and Portugal, which you will have seen if any of you watch Michael Portillo and his railway travels around Europe. It's the Continental Railway Guide, the Bradshaw's Continental Railway Guide is the one that he uses for that. And the other was O'Shea's Guide to Spain and Portugal. So Bradshaw and O'Shea were both centred on railway travel, both published for the first time in 1865, and both survived through numerous editions until the turn of the century. And although the man himself had died in 1858, Richard Ford's handbook was also quickly revised to reflect the new railway-centred travel experience. The fully up-to-date edition that appeared in 1868, now known as the John Murray Handbook after the publisher, would survive for 30 years until, along with Bradshaw and O'Shea, it was roundly superseded by the ultra-modern Baedeker Guide, published for the first time in 1898. So the last third of the 19th century saw Galicia and its railways firmly embedded in the major British travel guides to Spain. All four of the main guides, Murray, Bradshaw, O'Shea and Baedeker, built their itineraries around the main train route to Coruña via León, Monforte and Lugo, which in 1889 still required a staggering 30 hours to cover the 342 miles from Madrid. And while the advent of the railway certainly domesticated the wild and difficult travelling conditions made famous by Richard Ford, the possibility of excitement was never too far away, as Hugh James Rose, chaplain to the mining companies at Linares in the early 1870s, learned on visiting the small Galician station of Brañuelas, where he was thrilled to hear that a young railway employee had recently encountered and, importantly, shot dead a large bear. So as the travel guides made clear, while the railways opened up some parts of Galicia to travellers, large parts of the country remained remote, reachable only on foot or horseback or in a coach or diligence. At the same time, if you were travelling along the coast, it could often be quicker to go by one of the many boats or small steamers that plied the northern and western coastal routes. All four of the major guides balance practical information about timings and costs for the main rail line with suggestions for venturing off the beaten track. So, for example, at the tiny station of Puente de Domingo Flores, Murray notes that several rough but agreeable excursions can be made, and the village offers excellent headquarters for fishing in the Cabrera or the Sil. The reference to fishing recalls Ford's observation back in 1845 that Galicia was a paradise for the angler, and indeed travelling aficionados of the sport included the writer Walter Gallican, who visited in 1901 and wrote up his stay at Os Peares in the Sil Gorge in his book Fishing and Travel in Spain, which was published in 1904. And Gallican remembered especially how arriving at the tiny station of Os Peares in the middle of the night, having booked no accommodation, he and his wife had to be rescued by a fellow Brit known only as Mr. L, who was resident in that village for the fishing season. And Gallican's vivid descriptions of the Sil Gorge and the countryside around it place Galicia firmly within the romantic aesthetic familiar from almost a century of writing on Spain. It is, he says, lonely, rugged, a scene of beauty and majesty mingled with the terrific. The rolling, roaring river is cruel in its might, fierce and remorseless in its wild flow. It has claimed many victims. My wife was haunted with tragic dreams of this strange, fear-inspiring flood. And this vocabulary, albeit in slightly less dramatic fashion, is also the frame of reference for the four handbooks, where it's woven in with practical advice and occasional warnings. In aesthetic terms, the Galicia that emerges from these accounts is one of romantic, rocky gorges and a great deal of picturesqueness. The picturesque castle of Os Novais above the Sil, the highly picturesque Monforte, crowned with a ruined fortress and surrounded by picturesque wooden hovels, the picturesque, irregularly built Rivadavia, the picturesquely situated Tuy, or just to shake things up a bit, the wild and wood-clad gorges of the Minho. Of course, while the handbooks were with their peculiar combination of the purple and the practical, were a valuable source, they were by no means for everybody. For those who yearned for idiosyncrasy or who felt they needed a more personable guide than Baedeker, a series of formidable female travellers provided lively expertise on Galicia during the first decade of the 20th century. And one of these was Elizabeth Mayne, also known as Elizabeth Burnaby and Elizabeth Le Blonde, who was a pioneering photographer and the best known woman mountain climber of her time. And she travelled around Spain 3 times, producing a tourist handbook called Cities and Sights of Spain, which had editions in 1899 and 1904. Le Blonde, which was the name she finally settled on, had a healthy distrust of earlier handbooks with their often supercilious attitude to Spain and its people, and she firmly rejected the attempts of Baedeker and others to imply that travelling in Spain was anything other than straightforward. On her way through Galicia, she spent a long and delightful day at Lugo, renting a base for the day at the Hotel Méndez Núñez, which she noted had the usual Spanish peculiarity of looking very unpromisingly externally and being perfectly comfortable when entered. Le Blonde loved Lugo. She remarked on its, yes, picturesque market and the famous walk around the top of the walls, which she recommended taking towards evening, when the colours over the widely stretching country are especially beautiful. She was very adventurous, Le Blonde. She was especially thrilled by the opportunity to clamber through a trap door in the cellar of a Lugo chemist's shop to visit a fragment of Roman mosaic flooring, which Ford, half a century earlier, had been horrified to find barbarously used by the incurious townsfolk, which today is the site of a popular museum. Another formidable British lady who found her way to Galicia at the turn of the 20th century is Annette Meekin, who in January 1907 boarded a German steamship at Southampton, bound for the Galician port city of Coruña. 2 years later, she published the substantial and incredibly detailed Galicia, the Switzerland of Spain, which is one of the earliest English monographs dedicated entirely to Galicia, and which, as you might have guessed, takes its name from Richard Ford's description of the country more than half a century earlier. And Meekin opens her book with the declaration that Galicia is the least known and the least written about of all the little kingdoms that go to the making of Spain, and laments that the small amount of information relative to Galicia, which is to be obtained from English and French books, is distinctly unfavourable. We are told that her climate is damp and rainy, and that her inhabitants are dull, stubborn, and stupid, while her wonderful history, her exquisite scenery, and her fascinating architecture are barely alluded to, if not passed over in absolute silence. And Meekin's mission, carried out over almost 400 pages of densely written scholarship and personal observation, is to remedy this disappointing state of affairs. So this is the huge book that she wrote, Galicia, the Switzerland of Spain. It's a monster. Just to tell you a little bit more about her, she was a very experienced traveller and an even more experienced self-promoter. She counted herself as the first English woman to cross Siberia by rail in 1900, although in fact she was accompanied by her mum. So I suppose she was one of the first 2 English women to cross Siberia by rail. It depends which way around they were sent on the train. Nonetheless, she was also a formidable intellect, trained in music, medicine, classics, and anthropology. So the result, this fabulous book, is a very idiosyncratic study. It draws deeply on the academic and social networks Meekin rapidly established during her months in Galicia. She acquainted herself with the latest scholarship in anthropology, ethnography, linguistics, and history. She talked to journalists, scholars, and industrialists. And like Ford and others before her, she's especially attentive to the traces of English influence on Galicia's history and landscape, although it has to be said that her approach is rather less jingoistic than her predecessors. Almost the first thing that Meekin and her companion did on leaving their hotel was to visit the tomb of England's hero, Sir John Moore, about which you'll remember Richard Ford had been so exercised. But unlike Ford, who was furious about the Galicians' poor treatment of the site, Meekin declared herself horrified by the glaring and aggressive stone British lion and unicorn watching over the tomb. And she said, I wished them away, since modesty becomes the great as well as the brave. After all, it was the Spaniards who collected the money for More's monument. In Galicia, at the same time as Meakin, although the two almost certainly didn't meet, Rachel Chalice was an established translator of Spanish literature and history, a literary journalist, a political activist, and an early proponent of what we would probably today call public relations, as proprietor of Chalice's Spanish Information Bureau. During 1907 and 1908, she also undertook an extended tour of Spain, which included spending the summer of 1907 at the thriving modern spa hotel at Mondariz in southern Galicia, whose owners were keen to access the booming British tourist market. And Chalice was part of a little British colony in residence at the spa this summer, which included the British consul in Coruña and his family, and a gentleman called Samuel Pepys Cockerell, who recorded in the spa's visitor book on the 27th of June 1907 that the hotel is certainly one of the best in Spain. It is clean, comfortable, and well managed. The hotel's owners were keenly aware of the possibilities afforded by growing their British market, and they commissioned Chalice to produce a sumptuous promotional album designed to allay British travellers' fears, as encouraged by Baedeker and Company, by offering explicit reassurances about the comfort and hygiene of the hotel's facilities. And I have a copy of it here. It's enormous. You can see if I move it, it's with the gilded lettering, which is also on the back and all the way through. It is a really fabulous book. I'll just show you one picture so you can see a contemporary photograph of the spa hotel, which is still there today, but it's now apartments. There you go. So the sort of purpose of that wonderful book is to calm British tourists down in terms of the worries that they had and had for many decades about travelling in Spain. So Chalice is really good at this. So for those who are worried about bathroom facilities, which were one of the things that British tourists worried about, she emphasised how the hotel had been designed with British visitors very much in mind. She says, all the sanitary arrangements show that the proprietors did not go in vain to England to study such systems. Because English people are rather suspicious in Spain about the cleanliness of the cooking arrangements, Chalice visited the kitchens and reported back on the 5 white-capped, white-jacketed chefs in the meat and vegetable cooking department, reassuring her countrymen that the gridirons are suggestive of the British steak, and indeed one may say that at Mondariz it is done to perfection. As well as writing and photographing the promotional album for the spa, Chalice touted herself via Chalice's Spanish Information Bureau as the sole UK importer of Mondariz bottled mineral water. As we're going to see now, the collaboration between Rachel Chalice and the spa at Mondariz was the first step in what would become one of the most innovative Anglo-Spanish tourism projects of the 20th century. So the project that developed from Rachel Chalice's collaboration with the Mondariz Balneario brought together a group of businessmen led by the spa's owner, Enrique Peinador, the sardine canning magnate, Federico Barreras, and Alfred Allen Booth of the Liverpool-based Booth Steamship Company. During the 5 years between 1909 and 1914, these men headed a pioneering project to attract British tourists away from the established destinations of Andalusia and the Canary Islands and into this still unfamiliar northern region of the peninsula. And of course, it's no coincidence that the principal elements used for marketing the small-scale but successful package tours that carried hundreds of British tourists between Liverpool and Vigo during the 5 years of the project's existence were the spas, steamships, and sardines that formed the chief focus of the three men's business. The project's direct roots were in the visit that Alfred Allen Booth, who is the chairman of the Booth Shipping Company, made to Galicia with his wife in the summer of 1909. Booth's aim was to research the possibility of creating tourist links between Galicia and England on the model of the successful tours to Portugal and Madeira that his company had been running since 1903. His visit was widely reported in Galicia, where it was celebrated in the press as a crucial step in the opening up of the country's economy and culture to the world beyond Madrid. For his Galician hosts, a key objective of the partnership was to create a new role for Galicia as a modern, progressive nation with close historical, commercial and cultural connections to the booming Anglo-Saxon world. And crucially, one where their visitors would find none of the stereotypical Spanish behaviours that generations of British commentators had so loved to denigrate. Within 3 months of Booth's visit, the project was formalised by the creation of an association for the promotion of tourism in Galicia, with offices in Vigo and in London. And the composition of those two branches clearly shows us the nature of the project and the way that commercial, political and cultural objectives were firmly intertwined. So the members included journalists, newspaper proprietors, local politicians, diplomats and consuls, financiers, and representatives of several rail and shipping companies. With a careful eye on marketing, one of the committee's first acts was to invite the British International Association of Journalists to make its annual excursion for 1910 to Galicia, an invitation that was quickly accepted. At the same time, Booth commissioned the writer, Walter Wood, and the artist Frank Mason to travel to produce an illustrated volume aimed at British travellers, for whom Galicia would almost certainly be an unknown quantity. And in a neat coincidence of history, Wood and Mason left Liverpool for Vigo on October the 9th, 1909, the very same day on which Barreras' proposal for the foundation of the association was reported in the Spanish press. Wood and Mason, accompanied by Mrs. Mason, spent a month touring Galicia, during which time they were feted by their hosts. Their every doing was widely reported in the journals and newspapers owned by members of the Tourist Association and others as well. Like Booth himself several months before, their tour began on arrival at Vigo harbour. And the glory of that approach by sea to Vigo, Galicia's gateway, is promoted in these tours, heavily in these tours, and for two reasons. On the one hand, it distinguished the Booth travellers from other British tourists who would likely arrive by rail, following one of the itineraries set out in Baedeker's Handbook to Spain and Portugal. On the other hand, it also focuses the travellers' attention on southern Galicia and the Vigo region, that is the association's primary sphere of influence, rather than the better known northern route through the port of Coruña south to Santiago de Compostela. And the book they produced is called A Corner of Spain. I have a copy of it here. You can see from the stickies that it's well loved. But what's very unusual about this book, for a book of its time, is the colourful picture on the cover. So travel guides, those of you who know Victorian and Edwardian travel guides will know that the red and gilt was the sort of standard travel guide colours. But to include a picture on the cover was very, very unusual. And this is Frank Mason's painting of the Vigo harbour. You can see, hopefully you can see there with some little ships. And the fact that the company chose to put it on the cover shows you how important that approach was to all of their marketing. And I'll just show you as well a picture, the very first picture in the book, another of Mason's paintings, which is called Galicia's Golden Sands, which was another important element of the marketing. So in A Corner of Spain, the book, Wood starts off talking about his stay in Vigo. And it's a really weird mixture of tourist diary and public relations puff. So, for example, the only food he mentioned in the section on Vigo are the delicious platefuls of tinned sardines he enjoyed. While he says one of the most popular and interesting sites of Vigo, and the one that no visitor to Galicia should fail to inspect, is the sardine factory of Messrs. Barreras, beautifully situated at the end of the bay. And after that opening chapter, the book continues less as an itinerary than as a sort of series of set pieces interspersed with Frank Mason's paintings, like the ones that you've seen, some line drawings, and also Walter Wood's own photographs, many of which are sort of candid photographs of local people and children. The chapters have titles like Things Seen, where he firmly sort of points out the problems that Baedeker has in his coverage of Galicia. or locomotion, where he talks about trains, cars, bicycles, as well as Galicia's national vehicle, the diligence. But only 3 places other than Vigo, get a chapter to themselves. 2 of them, unsurprisingly, are Santiago de Compostela and A Coruña. But the third, which might have been a bit unexpected for those not in the know, was the small town of Mondariz. As Wood observes, preempting the language of exclusivity also favoured by 21st century newspaper journalists, this unfamiliarity is actually an advantage for the discerning traveller, since, he says, Mondariz has the great merit of being almost untravelled by and unknown to ordinary tourists. It's a really outstanding effort of public relations, which, you know, the very first line says, there is one health and pleasure resort in Galicia, which is in the nature of an earthly paradise, and that is Mondariz. With a nod to his employer, Alfred Allen Booth, who had just been appointed chairman of the Cunard Line, Wood suggests that the hotel is certainly the most remarkable in the peninsula and might almost be compared with a Mauritania on land. It is so complete and self-contained. Clearly with one eye on his mission as an ad man, Wood also comes up with a slogan for the resort. It is no exaggeration, he says, to speak of this great undertaking as Mondariz the Marvellous. The second sally in the promotion of Galicia to British tourists took place 9 months later, when, in what is still perhaps the most audacious intervention to date in the shaping of Galicia's public image, 17 British journalists were brought by the Tourist Association on a 2-week junket to Galicia, where they were hosted, cosseted, feted by a network of businessmen, every detail of their tour exhaustively reported by the press, not only in Galicia, but also in Madrid. They travelled under the auspices of the British International Association of Journalists, whose secretary, James Baker of the Morning Post, and president, Samuel Smith Campion of the Northampton Mercury, along with their journalist wives, became the public faces in the Spanish and Galician press of los periodistas ingleses, the English journalists. The rather breathless itinerary they undertook clearly demonstrates how the organisers intended to promote Galicia's modernity and industry, not only in their choice of the places to be visited, but also by ensuring that Vigo, which one of the journalists described as a very go-ahead place, and the south maintained a priority position. And they really annoyed journalists from Lugo and the northern coast because they didn't go there. They were very disappointed. In the many newspaper and magazine articles they published on their return to England, the journalists are at pains to stress the comfort and cleanliness of the facilities at Mondariz, where the whole huge establishment is lighted with electricity and is in every respect most modern and sanitary. The need to promote their host's commercial interests also clearly comes through. So, for example, one of the journalists, J. Harris Stone, talks about the Mondariz mineral water bottling industry and the enormous number of bottles in cases that are sent yearly all over Spain, Portugal, the West Indies and South America. But he carefully notes the problem that at present, Mondariz water is scarcely known in England. And in these writings, the spa at Mondariz emerges as a central coordinate in the newly imagined geography of a modern Anglo-Saxon facing Galicia. Its primary significance in these writings is not as a centre for medical excellence, rest and restoration, or even a social hub, but as a complex industrial network, a showcase for the juxtaposition of tradition and modernity, and a shining example of social progressiveness and commercial innovation, making the apparently paradoxical question of Galician modernity a crucial aspect of this innovative marketing of Galicia to Edwardian tourists. So we can see this, for example, when Catherine Gascoigne Hartley, one of the journalists, wrote about Mondariz. And she talked about the estate's small industrial plant in terms of its visual appeal. She says, I recall the many visits I made to the bottling water factory, which was to me one of the most delightful spots in Mondariz. Here, picturesque men and women work in batches day and night, filling, corking and labelling over 10,000 bottles during the 24 hours. A more industrious and charming scene of labour, and one more typical of the country, it would not be possible to find. Wherever we walked, in every direction, we saw a charming scene of labour. After Mondariz, everything would be compared to those first glorious days. The group went on to spend 2 nights at the rival British-owned spa of La Toja, where they took a boat trip to the Isla de Cortegada, which had just been donated by the Galician people to King Alfonso and his English Queen Enna. And Hartley clearly distinguished between the marketing of those 2 rival spa establishments, the Galician-owned Mondariz and the British-owned La Toja. And she writes, "What delighted me was that with all this modern comfort, Mondariz is still a Spanish hotel with that Spanish character that I know not how to describe, but which everyone who has felt its charm will know. La Toja, I think, has lost this. It is the happy spirit of Mondariz." And Hartley's description of La Toja reveals the essential tension at the heart of the journalist project between the celebration of progress and a lament for what's lost in its wake. She says, "The vigorous invasion of modern progress is never quite absent in La Toja. He who loves this gracious land will not find himself so much at home as in the Spanish hotel at Mondariz. It was difficult for me, at least, not to feel this great modern palace as a parasitic growth. La Toja Hotel is under the management of a British company. This explains the presence here of the English games of tennis and golf. Wherever the Anglo-Saxon resorts, he wants to live precisely as he does at home. He has so little imagination. He must have the same food, bacon and eggs for breakfast. You can have these at La Toja. Beefsteak for dinner. The same drinks, his whiskey, his tea, and his games." The next stage of the tour in Santiago de Compostela was relatively sedate and conventional, but the Coruña leg of the journey that followed was much more breathless and idiosyncratic and designed specifically to show off 2 things. Once again, Galicia's modern industry and also her close commercial and cultural links with Britain. And it included things like lunch with the English colony, a Sir John Moore themed tour of the city. They went to the sporting club for military horse trials, and of course a day trip to Ferrol to see the arsenal and the warships, where the ladies were not terribly impressed by the patriotic pronunciations of their male colleagues on learning that the dockyards were largely British run and British financed. But the highlight was generally agreed to have been the visit to the tomb of Sir John Moore, the centenary of whose death had been commemorated the previous year, which provided, as one of them wrote, the chief interest in Coruña to English people. As Hartley writes in her account of the trip, "We repaired to the historic city, chiefly with the view of accomplishing as British citizens a sentimental pilgrimage, which we in fact achieved under most agreeable conditions." So it was an absolutely whistle-stop tour. They were taken around in motor cars. They didn't have a moment to stop. And it was no wonder that the journalist and novelist G.B. Bergin, who was one of the party, when he published his memoir about a decade later, remembered the trip fondly, if a little blurrily. He wrote, "We had a perfectly regal reception everywhere. Spanish hospitality is proverbial. But it was only on our return home that my friend Walter Gerald became regretful. I know we're back in England again," he sorrowfully observed, "because I have to pay for my own lunch." On their return home, the journalists kept up their side of the bargain, publishing reams of articles, letters and books, and giving lectures, speeches and slideshows promoting the modern, industrial and Anglophile, but paradoxically still very primitive, untouched and authentic Galicia that they'd visited. And a crucial aspect of all of this activity was its geographical reach, because this was no metropolitan exercise aimed at wealthy London audiences, but designed to reach into the provinces. So not only by publishing articles in regional newspapers, but also by taking talks and slideshows to institutes and church halls all over the country. And in fact, by looking at the data, both from the Mondariz hotel visitors books and from shipping manifests, we can see that the vast majority of people who went on these tours, who travelled with the big line to Galicia, were from all over the country, from a lot of them from the northwest, obviously, because the ships sailed from Liverpool, but also from the northeast and from Hull, from the Midlands, lots of places. And most of them, or the ones that we can, or whose occupations we can discover, were middle-class professionals, teachers, pharmacists, lawyers, things like that. When we look back at all of those writings and talks that the journalists did, we find certain key themes, a number of slogans that they repeated again and again. So Galicia's Golden Sands, which is the name of that picture we looked at, A Corner of Spain, like the book, Mondariz the Marvelous, Vigo, Galicia's Golden Gateway, the paradoxical nature of Galicia's modernity, which was sold to them aggressively during their fortnight in the country, is a constant subject for comment, particularly when compared with the predominant Anglo view of Galicia as one of the most backward regions, as one of the most backward countries in Europe. As Hartley, invoking one of the Booth-inspired tourist slogans, observed, that is the special interest of this corner of Spain. It is a museum of the past preserved and perpetuated in the midst of the new progress of the present. The Mondariz project left an important cultural legacy in both Galicia and the UK, as the dozens of books, articles, photographs and paintings produced by writers and artists in the project's employ formed a distinctive visual and imaginative identity for a region that until then had played a relatively peripheral part in the British cultural imagination. The version of Galicia centred on Vigo and Mondariz that emerges from the complex visual and textual repertoire developed by the Booths is unfamiliar, innovative, and had vast potential for a Galician future based on direct cultural and commercial connections with the booming Anglo-Saxon world. But thanks to the outbreak of the First World War, this potential would remain sadly unrealised, because when European leisure tourism resumed after the First World War, the Booth line had moved on to the Amazon, their famous 1,000-mile up the Amazon tours, and the pendulum of Anglo tourist interest in Spain had moved back decisively to the sunny south. So just to wrap up, it's clear that the ambitious Mondariz project had a transformative effect on Galicia's place in the Edwardian imagination. Like the other examples we've met today of British travel in Galicia, it reveals how Anglo-Galician encounters during the 19th and early 20th centuries were shaped by a range of sometimes unexpected factors, not least the long history of commercial and industrial connections between the two countries. Although generally forgotten today, these encounters have left their traces in Galicia's landscape, culture, and even its language. As they say in Ferrol, get there a todo filispin, at full speed, and you might just see or hear them for yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Really wonderful talk. Myself, I have traveled not quite a lot around Galicia, but I have learned so much tonight. So thank you very much. And the floor is open. You might to put your questions to Dr. Hooper about the talk about Galicia. She's one of the greatest experts about the Galician culture in general, not only about traveling. I have myself. You mentioned in the talk those families that settled in Galicia at the end of the 18th century for commercial reasons. Do you know if they still those British communities of those British families they settled and they mixed with the local Galicians, or they kept like an expat community in Galicia? How was and how is the reality nowadays? If you can tell us about it.
Well, there's an excellent book on the 18th century British and Irish communities in Ferrol by Mónica Amenedo, which I recommend wholeheartedly. And she looked in great detail at those communities. My understanding is that the community in Ferrol largely remained separate from the Galician community. So the ship workers and some were a fairly isolated community, unlike at Sargadelos, where we know that a lot of the British potters, the men who came to work in the pottery, did marry Galician girls. Some of them stayed in Spain and some of them went back to England. So there were examples of both.
Good, thank you. Also, Mondariz had and has nowadays a very important role in the Galicia as an icon and as a touristic place. I didn't know that it had such an importance from the very beginning. And I didn't know also about the participation of the British in the whole project. How emerged this idea to build? Because I think that there are thermal waters in Mondariz, yes?
Mondariz, that's correct.
It's well known for that, and that's what came to my mind when I think about Mondariz, the Aguas de Mondariz. But what came about this joint project, British and Spanish, to build a luxurious hotel in that place and to develop as a very important touristic resort nowadays as well.
It is, and it's a lovely, lovely place. Well, the spa and the hotel predated any English involvement. So the Peinador family sort of developed the spa around the existing springs. And you probably know it was hugely important sort of political meeting place, as well as social. I think Pardo Bazán went there and all sorts of people. The British connection came about because Barreras, who was the chap who owned the sardine cannery, was also a shipping agent for the Booth shipping company. He was the shipping agent in Vigo. And the Booth ships called at Vigo on their way on to South America. So they had, what tended to happen is that they had spare capacity on the leg from England to Spain, where they picked up lots more people to go on to Latin America. So as they'd done with Portugal and Madeira, one of the ways that they did, you know, made something of this was to fill the first leg with tourists. So that's where the connection came from. But it was very much driven by the Galician partners, who were strong political regionalists and wanted to develop Vigo as a modern industrial city. And they saw this connection as a means to that end. So that's how it all came about.
Very, very, very interesting. Really great. I mean, I have so many things about it, so rich and so exciting. The subject. Galicia had so many faces, so many aspects. The language, the literature about Galicia. We could make it hours or days, months speaking about Galicia. But anyway, from my point of view, it's such a diversity in all aspects about Galicia. The people are really friendly, not as you mentioned also in this anecdote, the hospitality of the Galicians, and the food. The food is really a subject, a great subject in the Galician culture and tradition. They eat a lot and they eat very well in Galicia.
It is, yes, wonderfully. I can see we have, Pedro, I can see we have a question in the chat from Anthony. Hello, Anthony, who says, I'm
sorry about that. I didn't see the question. So you can ask, read and ask.
I can
see that on my, I don't know why.
So Anthony says, can we recommend our top 5 places to visit whilst in Galicia? Wow, that's a hard one. Only 5. I mean, I think if you've never been there, then Santiago de Compostela has to be a port of call for the cathedral and all those many, many years of history. Certainly, I would recommend Mondariz, but I'm slightly biased because I think it's wonderfully fascinating. It's a lovely, lovely place to go. I'm trying to be equal opportunities about all of the different places you might see. If you want to see the coast, the Costa da Morte, which is the Atlantic coast of Galicia, somewhere like Noia or Muros, some of the small sort of the smaller coastal communities are beautiful and give a wonderful place. How many is that? That's 3. A wonderful idea. I recommend Bayona, which is almost as far south as you can go in Galicia on the coast, which is has a strong connection with Christopher Columbus and really fabulous seafood. And I would also recommend Rivadavia, which is inland in Orense, which is the Ribeira Sacra, where lots of wonderful wine comes from. But honestly, I don't think you can go wrong in Galicia. I truly don't. And you asked about book suggestions post 1900. There is a really good concise history of Galicia by Sharif Jemi, which was published in 2006, which is still the sort of the best short introduction to Galicia that you can find, which I recommend 100% as well. So thank you for your question, Anthony.
Thank you. We have a comment from Maria Seijo. And she said, muchísimas gracias por la sua interesante conferencia.
Gracias,
Being in Coruña, I have been countless times at Sir John Moore's tomb, which has a poem by Rosalía de Castro about how sad it is to die far away from your motherland. Very emotional, yeah.
It's a beautiful poem. There's also and there's a very famous poem which I can't remember if it's also represented there by an English author, which is about the burial of Sir John Moore. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note. Apparently it was learned by generations of British schoolchildren. My grandfather remembered having to learn the poem of Sir John Moore at school. So he really has kind of stayed in the national memory. By John Wolfe. Thank you, Maria. Yes, it is there, is it? It is there at the tomb as well. Yes, it's still a lovely place to visit. It's a little garden in Coruña, sort of overlooking the water, like a little garden and park, and it's a lovely place to go and sit still.
Any more questions? Thank you very much. So if there are no more questions, we come to an end, unfortunately, because I feel, and I see in the audience, everybody felt this passion about Galicia, and we are very committed to go back, those who already know, and the people who don't know yet, really recommending. Some of the best beaches in the world are in Galicia. The water is not very warm, but the landscapes and the places and the coach, as I said. So in September, we will have our next talk about Madrid with Professor Hooper. Thank you very much, Kirsty, for your wonderful talk. Muchas gracias, muito obrigado, and see you soon. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you, everybody.